Well, good morning, everybody. This is Barry Jones again with SP History. Back for another day sightseeing, walking tour here in Dallas. And this morning I'm starting off at Parkland Hospital, which is an enormous place. Just the hospital itself. It's very interesting. I'm going to turn the camera around, which I'm sure it didn't look like this in 1963, but it looks like from a architectural standpoint, my dad was an architect, so I noticed these things. It looks like a double wide on top of a double wide, or like dominoes stacked crossways on top of each other. It's just freaking enormous. That's the hospital proper there, and then it's kind of hard to see from where I'm standing, but it's just this huge medical center complex all the way around it with the big children's hospital. And of course, parking is at a premium. Yeah, I am double parked down the street, so it's the only place I could find. So I better hurry through this or I may be without a ride. So, Trauma Room 1. Now, I've purposely come to this part of the hospital because this is the emergency entrance. I'll turn the camera around and see as you come in through here. This is the emergency entrance right here, and I might walk through here and talk as I walk. They've got security everywhere. They may run me off, but as far as I know, this is sort of the same layout, 1963, and so this is where Kennedy was brought. And the pictures that I've seen, obviously this is new building, this is new construction, but what I've heard described of the scene was they were in the back, or the emergency entrance was in the back, so this might be considered the back of the hospital. And indeed, when my Google Maps, when I told them to take me to Parkland Hospital, they had me going around to the other side. I came here because I saw the emergency entrance, so I'm thinking this is the back, and this is where the limo was sitting, and of course it attracted a crowd, and nurses were poking pencils through the hole in the windshield, and of course everyone was looking at the blood. The bloody mess in the back seat. It was an open car. You could walk right up to it, look down inside, and so at some point the Secret Service cordoned it off, shoot everybody away, and then took the car around to another side of the hospital, and with we'll talk about what they did with it at that point, but this is where they came. And of course they were followed by the 4 motorcycles, several other vehicles that were in the motorcade, and it's right off the Stemmons Freeway. So we've been in Dealey Plaza. You saw how close the Stemmons Freeway was to Dealey Plaza, so it's just a matter of hop, skip, and a jump. Get on Stemmons, fly down the interstate, offload here. But though it was so close, the president was already dead. I mean, for all intents and purposes. They didn't rule him dead because he was Catholic, and they wanted a priest to administer last rites before they ruled him dead. So, but what I want to talk about this morning are some of the things that were necessary to the narrative taking shape almost immediately upon Kennedy being brought here to Parkland Hospital. First of all, Trauma Room 1, ironically, was site to 3 famous people in relatively short order, 2 of them within 2 days. JFK was brought to Trauma Room 1 on November 22nd, 1963. Of course, that's where he was declared dead. 2 days later, his alleged assailant, assassin, Lee Harvey Oswald, died in that same hospital in the same trauma room. And story about LBJ phoning the hospital, ordering the Secret Service to remain by his bedside. He hadn't been declared dead yet, and the order was to stay there in case he came to and wanted to make a final deathbed confession. He wanted the Secret Service there to take that confession. A lot of suspicion about that whole phone call and the purpose of it. You know, pretty sure that he's going to die, and they want a confession because there's not going to be a trial. If you're aware of the Katzenbach memo and which he was the assistant attorney general, saying we need to convince the American people that Lee Harvey Oswald acted alone, that he was guilty, he would have been found guilty if there had been a trial, and he didn't have any Confederates, there was no conspiracy, etc., etc. And it was all about convincing the American people. And so it appeared that the White House was very concerned about the optics of this and wanted the American people to buy in to the idea that Lee Harvey Oswald acted alone. So anyway, LBJ makes this phone call, and whether he was going to make a confession or not, it almost appears like they were going to manufacture one if there weren't doctors in the room. Or if he wasn't going to die, make sure that he did die. I don't know. There's just something very odd about that phone call. The President of the United States ordering the Secret Service to surround his bed, and in his condition, either take a final think about it for a second. Take a final deathbed confession. If you just think about that, it doesn't even make sense. If he comes to enough that he can give a confession, how do you know it's a final confession? Unless you make sure that after he gives his confession, that's the last thing he says. If he comes to being treated here at a hospital, there'd be the hope, or at least the assumption, that he would be recovering, that he might come out of, he might recover from his injuries. So it's almost like code. We want you there to take his final deathbed confession, meaning get him to say something, get him to confess, and then kill him, or make sure he dies. There's been a lot of suspicion about Oswald dying as a result of one gunshot wound to the abdomen, as it is, and as if the question is whether or not he had any help. But that's not the purpose of today's video. And or the other option is they were there to make sure Oswald didn't say anything that could hurt the narrative. He'd already said he was a patsy. Maybe he had some other information he could blurt out. So they were there by acting on the orders of the new president, LBJ, to contain the situation. And if he wanted to confess, they would allow it. If they wanted to say something else, they wouldn't allow it. If he wanted to live, that probably wasn't going to be allowed either, because they had already made a decision there couldn't be a trial. Absolutely cannot be a trial. All the bullshit that we've been discussing, the evidence and the narrative and the doppelgangers and everything that's been manufactured and put up against him would fall apart like a house of cards if there was a trial. There cannot be a trial. He has to die. If he wants to confess before he dies, great. If not, he's not going to say anything. It's going to hurt the narrative. So you have JFK on November 22nd. You have Lee Harvey Oswald on the 24th. And then another major player in this is Jack Ruby. He dies January 3, 1967. Literally 28 days after he was diagnosed with cancer. If anyone has followed any of my Medical Manhattan videos, that should arouse a little bit of suspicion or intrigue in your mind. He hadn't had any cancer, and all of a sudden, after he got a second trial, his first verdict was thrown out, and the judge said, "We'll give you another trial. This time you have to talk." He gets diagnosed with cancer within days of that, and 28 days later, to the day, he dies here at Parkland Hospital. Same room, trauma room. Amazing. Parkland Hospital is the site of some pretty clear and obvious evidence tampering right off the bat. You have the limo, which, as I indicated earlier, pulled in. It was damaged, blood everywhere. It's a crime scene, and people were gathered around. And once the Secret Service realized how compromising that would be to the narrative, they removed the limo. You know, as I said, nurses were poking pencils through the front windshield. There was a bullet hole, which pretty conclusively proves the existence of a front shot. And so they immediately take it around to the other side of the hospital, away from prying eyes, begin hosing it down, cleaning it. They had a bucket with warm, soapy water in it, sponges. And they're cleaning a crime scene before the investigation has even begun. That's clearly evidence tampering. JFK and Connolly's clothing, I want to be clear about this. The clothing was not destroyed, but it was removed, and such that the autopsy didn't have it available to study it to help with the decision about trajectory of bullets, where the bullets hit the body, etc., the bodies, etc., etc. The clothing was later cleaned, or not cleaned, but it was later given to the National Archives. JFK's was given to the National Archives, where it still is under lock and key. And I believe Connolly's clothing is with the Texas Archives, the state archives. Not 100% positive on that. But the important thing is the clothing was removed. And the first step in the investigation, of course, this is going to be the launch pad for the Warren Commission in their investigation, is this autopsy report. And neither sets of clothing were used in the autopsy report, which is the first indication that the autopsy was rigged. Later, the clothing was used by the Warren Commission after they realized they didn't have it available to them in the autopsy report. And then later, again, it was used by the House Select Committee in the late 70s. And it's interesting, same set of clothing, neither investigative body agreed with the other as to the measurements where the bullets came through the shirt and the jacket with respect to Kennedy. They couldn't agree on anything. And so the clothing really sort of became, it's like a moot point. It didn't render anything conclusive, even though it should have. But the biggest evidence tampering in this scenario is the fact that the clothing was removed, so the autopsy didn't have, these medical examiners or pathologists performing the autopsy didn't have the clothing at their disposal to balance against what they're seeing on the bodies and juxtapose the two and make a good determination about where the bullets hit the bodies. So that was evidence tampering. And then, of course, JFK's body was removed for a rigged autopsy in D.C. This had to happen. If you're trying to control the narrative and you can't allow an honest autopsy to take place. It's going to be clear. I mean, all 7 doctors who treated the president here at Parkland Hospital agreed about what they saw in the trauma room. These are surgeons, doctors. They all insisted that because of its size, the wound in the throat had to be an entrance wound. Well, that's a problem. Dr. McClellan drew a sketch of the front entrance wounds to JFK's throat, the side front entrance wound to his head, and the exit wounds to the back of his head and his back. And he clearly marked on his drawing, you could see the front of the president's head, the back, and he clearly drew in wounds of entrance, wounds of exit, and he signed his name to it. 26 Parkland medical personnel. These are doctors, these are surgeons, these are nurses. They're all experienced with these sorts of things. Testified that the back of the president's head was, quote, blasted out. That was the terminology they used, which is indicative of a frangible bullet. Interestingly, this is a little sidelight here. A frangible bullet to the head, if it's one shooter, the shooter would be using the same type of bullet or same type of rounds for all 3 shots, right? So it'd be 3 frangible bullets. But the other 2 bullets weren't frangible. The magic bullet we're going to get to here in a minute, couldn't have been frangible to do all its going through 2 bodies causing 7 wounds. A frangible bullet explodes on contact. So if 2 of the bullets, and then the bullet that nicked James Tague was not frangible, right? The bullet that they found, the magic bullet they found on the stretcher allegedly at Parkland Hospital, was intact after having gone through 2 bodies and caused 7 wounds. So it's clearly not frangible. But yet the bullet that hit him in the head was frangible. This is some of the clearest evidence that there were at least 2 shooters, different kinds of bullets. Anyway, that's why they described the back of the president's head as blasted out. A frangible bullet creates a small wound of entrance and a huge gaping wound of exit as it blasts out, as it explodes out the back. Another drawing by Dr. McClellan shows the blasted out section, where he actually turns the president's head around and draws the blasted out section. It's a huge gaping wound that you could just look right into and see the interior of the president's head. The Parkland photos that didn't emerge for years afterwards, but they're now available, shows the back of the president's head completely missing. They got him laying on a stretcher, and you can tell his hair is just flopping over the back of the gurney, but there's no head there to support the head. So the head's there's like, several inches worth of skull just missing. So the president's head is laying flatter on the gurney than it would ordinarily do, which is why the hair is flopping over. Clearly the back of the head is gone. The 7 doctors that I referenced earlier told the story of what happened to Dr. Earl Rose. Now, this is the chief forensic pathologist at Parkland Hospital in '63. He was supposed to perform the autopsy. He later performed the autopsies of J.D. Tippit, Lee Harvey Oswald, and Jack Ruby. And so, by state law, back then, assassinations weren't a federal crime. It was considered just a regular murder. That's a state crime. And wherever the murder is committed, that's where the autopsy is supposed to be performed. But before he could carry out the autopsy on JFK, Secret Service agents threatened him with a Thompson submachine gun, and they took the body away. And Dr. Rose was an expert in bullet wounds, and he would have been able to discover quickly the trajectory of the bullets. He would have also been able to consult with his colleagues right there on site, right? You don't need to phone them, or talk by phone. You can talk to him right there. You can go in and talk to him face to face. He would have also been able to consult with his colleagues about the tracheotomy that had taken place by the wound in the throat. The pathologists in Bethesda didn't, once they found that there was a tracheotomy performed, they just counted that as a tracheotomy, even though the Dallas doctors performed the tracheotomy over a bullet hole. That's why they performed it there. So there's already a hole there. Let's just do the trach right there. And the guys in Bethesda didn't know that at first. They didn't know that there was a bullet hole first before the tracheotomy. If the autopsy is performed here like it's supposed to, all of that is known, right? The Dr. Rose pointed out to the Secret Service, he says, hey, it's the law. Autopsy, the murder was committed here, the autopsy has to be performed here. The Secret Service just responded by pushing them up against the wall, and they moved the body along the hospital corridor and basically just bullied it away. They kidnapped the body. That's what they did. So those are just a few few examples of evidence manipulation that took place right here at Parkland. And then another thing that sort of got its start here at Parkland was this whole idea of a magic bullet. The original story was that a bullet, an intact, what they call a pristine bullet, was found allegedly at Parkland Hospital, and they said it fell out of JFK's back wound. That was the original story. And then the revised story was the bullet entered JFK's back and exited his neck before falling out on the gurney and being found at Parkland Hospital. That was the revised story. And then the revised story was, well, the bullet entered JFK's back, exited his neck, then entered Governor John Connally and created all sorts of wounds in Connally before it fell out of his left thigh on a stretcher at Parkland Hospital. If you follow the statements of the authorities about this bullet that was allegedly found in a gurney in Parkland Hospital, the story keeps changing because the narrative, they're putting the pieces together and realizing we have too many wounds, We have this guy, James Tague, who was injured by a shot that nicked him he was standing at the base of the triple underpass. That means 3 bullets, but now one of them is removed because it hit Tague. It was a miss, and so now 2 bullets have to create 8 remaining wounds. One of them took his head off, the president's head off. So now 1 bullet has to create 7 wounds. And so now they got this bullet. As they learn this, they keep changing what this bullet did. They revise the story, then they revise it again. Dr. McClellan testified that the bullet that hit JFK in the back was 6 inches below his shirt collar. And the question was, well, how could it exit his throat? You know, it was coming down, allegedly, from the Texas School Book Depository or a building, and then it hits him in the back, and it turns and goes up and comes out the president's neck. That doesn't even make sense. And that's what Dr. McClellan said. He also said, how could a bullet that didn't pass through JFK's body end up creating 6 more wounds? He said he could reach in there with his pinky and touch the end of the wound. The bullet was gone, but he could touch the end of the wound. It didn't, according to him, traverse, which I guess is a medical term for it didn't pass through. So it's impossible. This is why the autopsy had to be rigged, because as I'm going through this, you're seeing what the doctors and the medical personnel here at Parkland saw is not jiving with the narrative and what their testimony. It doesn't go along. The senior engineer at Parkland Hospital who found the bullet allegedly said that he saw a man pushing the stretcher from which the bullet fell. So the man's pushing the stretcher through the hallways. The bullet falls off. He's testified that he reached down, he picked it up. And they had always said that this was the stretcher John Connally came in on, and that bullet was found on the stretcher. Well, here's 2 problems with it. The engineer who found it said, no, it wasn't on the stretcher, it was on the floor. I found it on the floor. And it was on an empty stretcher. It was not the stretcher that Connally was on. So you got all that. And so there's a lot of suspicion that bullet was planted, especially when you see the appearance of it. It's literally pristine. There's a tiny little dimple in the front of it, the only damage in the entire bullet. And there was more metal in Connally's wrist wound or injury than was missing from this so-called magic bullet. So it couldn't be the same bullet. It couldn't be. And the suspicion was, if you heard my video about Jack Ruby, I called him Waldo because after the assassination, during the assassination, he was everywhere. During the assassination, he was standing in front of the Postal Annex building, or the Terminal Annex building now, watching across the infield grass towards the grassy knoll. So he was there. Then after the shooting, he ends up here at Parkland Hospital. According to Seth Cantor, who was a Dallas Times Herald columnist or journalist who knew Jack Ruby well, he used Jack Ruby as a source in a lot of his stories. Cantor was actually in the presidential motorcade, so by default, he ends up here at Parkland Hospital with the motorcade. And when he's here, he sees Jack Ruby. And they talk. They have a 5-minute conversation, according to Seth Cantor, in a hallway. And he remembers the gist of the conversation. He says, yeah, we were talking about whether or not Jack Ruby should close his nightclub for the weekend out of respect for what happened. And of course, Ruby denied being here, and the Warren Commission believed Ruby instead of Cantor. And then next we find him at the Texas Theater observing Lee Harvey Oswald be arrested, and then he spends the next 2 days at Dallas Police Headquarters watching for his opportunity to kill Oswald. The suspicion is that while he was here, and the purpose of his being here at Parkland Hospital was to plant that bullet. And that's why they had to go to such lengths to deny that he was here and to discredit Seth Cantor. So we see clearly evidence tampering taking place immediately here at Parkland, and then the origins of this magic bullet and some arguing about how it was found, where it was found, etc., etc. We also have Parkland Hospital as the site of some pretty obvious and extreme witness intimidation. Dr. Charles Baxter, who was the emergency room director at Parkland Hospital, called a meeting of all the people in the trauma room immediately after the president was declared dead. And he told them they must never talk about what they had seen during the treatment of JFK. And they also received other messages they were likely to come to harm This is the 7 doctors. This is their testimony. If they ever talked about the entrance wound in the throat or to anyone else, there was no mention about the head shot. There was no mention about the back shot. They didn't want anybody talking about that entrance wound in the throat, because that's a front shot. Dr. Malcolm Perry, the Parkland doctor who performed the tracheotomy on JFK, told the press 3 different times, 3 times, in the press conference immediately afterwards, that the throat wound was a, quote, wound of entrance. And the original news coverage, that's what they said. Later, after the meeting with Dr. Baxter and some subsequent pressure from the Secret Service, Dr. Perry changed his mind and testified to the Warren Commission later that it was a wound of exit. He completely changed his testimony. Elmer Moore, the Secret Service enforcer that was sicked on all the, he was let loose on all these doctors and other people, witnesses on Dealey Plaza, etc., etc. Elmer Moore was the enforcer. And the inspector, the Secret Service inspector, Thomas Kelly, assigned Elmer Moore to intimidate certain Parkland doctors into changing their stories. And so the narrative originally was that the throat wound was a wound of entrance, but it changed to a wound of exit. That all happened here at Parkland Hospital. And all the exit wounds in the back of JFK's head turned magically into entrance wounds. So they just completely turned the truth upside down on its head. Entrance became exit, exit became entrance, and voila, the narrative is preserved. And they threaten them losing their licenses and physical or bodily harm if they ever come out and say anything about the front neck wound being a wound of entrance. And that narrative took shape right here in Parkland Hospital in the trauma room right after the president was declared dead, and has continued for 60 years since. That's how important it is to get control of the narrative of an event like this immediately. We've already learned they're doing that in Dealey Plaza as we speak. They got people running around flashing Secret Service badges, taking people's film and cameras and pressuring people to change their stories. You didn't hear 5 shots. Those were echoes, right? And now they're doing the same thing here at Parkland. So that is Parkland Hospital. I found a little spot here where I could kind of stand out of the way, and now I get to go back and find out if my car has been towed. So wish me luck on that. So this is Parkland Hospital. See you at the next site.